It started with smoke, thick, black, rolling through the cracks of an apartment door just past midnight. Neighbors pounded on the walls, some screaming, others frozen in fear. But by the time firefighters forced their way inside, it was already too late. One man would never make it out. His name was Carlos, a 42-year-old father who had been trying to rebuild his life. At first, everyone thought it was just a tragic accident, a fire sparked by faulty wiring, the kind of tragedy that could happen to anyone. But within days, investigators began asking questions no one wanted to hear. Because what happened inside that small apartment wasn't as simple as it first appeared. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The night of May 14th began like any other for the residents of Maple Court Apartments. Families were settling down after long days, kids tucked into bed, dinners finished, the hum of televisions playing in the background. Nothing about that evening suggested that within hours, the building would become the center of one of the deadliest tragedies the city had ever faced. It was just past midnight when the first signs of danger appeared. Some residents woke to the faint smell of smoke. Others were stirred by the muffled sound of coughing from neighboring units. At first, many thought it was nothing more than burnt food or maybe a small kitchen accident. But then the unmistakable crackle of flames pierced the silence. Within minutes, panic set in. Thick black smoke began seeping through door frames and vents. Parents shook their children awake, their voices trembling as they tried to remain calm. Shouts of "Get out! Get out!" echoed down the hallways. But escape was not simple. The narrow stairwells filled with choking smoke almost instantly. Some doors were jammed, refusing to open in the heat. Neighbors pounded on walls, calling each other's names, desperate to know who had made it out and who hadn't. From the street, witnesses watched in horror as flames leapt from window to window. One described seeing a woman holding her child at the second-floor balcony, screaming for help. Another remembered the sound of breaking glass as residents tried to make their own way out. The first fire trucks arrived within minutes, but the scene was already overwhelming. Sirens lit up the street, firefighters racing to get ladders into place. They carried people down, one by one, their faces covered in soot, their bodies shaking from fear and smoke inhalation. But for others trapped inside, help came too late. Some never made it past their doors. Others collapsed in hallways just feet away from safety. By the time dawn broke, the Maple Court Apartments were reduced to a charred skeleton of what had been a home for dozens of families. For survivors, the memories of that night would never fade. The sound of screams in the dark, the sight of neighbors they would never see again, the guilt of escaping when others couldn't. For families of the victims, a single question began to haunt them. Why did this happen? And for investigators, a deeper suspicion was already forming. Long before the fire turned Maple Court Apartments into a national headline, it was simply home. A 3-story building on the edge of the city with faded paint on its walls and creaking staircases, but alive with families who were trying to build something better. Each apartment held its own story. On the 3rd floor lived David and Linda Cooper, a young couple raising their 2-year-old son. David worked overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse, often returning home just before sunrise. Linda, who was still adjusting to life as a stay-at-home mother, often sat by the window with her son, pointing out passing cars on the street below. To their neighbors, the Coopers seemed like any other young family, tired but hopeful.
Just down the hall, Mrs. Evelyn Harris, a retired school teacher, had lived in the building for over 20 years. She was the one neighbors turned to when they needed advice or even a cup of sugar. Evelyn often baked cookies for the children in the building, and some of them still called her Grandma Harris. In the corner unit on the second floor, Marcus Reynolds, a college student, lived alone. He balanced his nights between working at a local diner and studying criminal justice. Friends described him as quiet, focused, and determined to be the first in his family to graduate college. But there were others too. A single mother raising 3 kids, an older couple who had recently retired, and a young man who had just moved in, still surrounded by unpacked boxes. Together, they created a tapestry of everyday life, bound not by wealth or status, but by shared hallways and thin apartment walls. For the most part, life at Maple Court was ordinary. Neighbors greeted each other at mailboxes. Children played in the small courtyard after school, and the sound of laughter, arguments, and late-night televisions drifted through the building. But behind the walls, not every life was without struggle. Bills piled up, relationships strained. Some families carried secrets that never reached the hallways. And though the residents could not have known it, the night of the fire would bring all of their stories crashing together in the most devastating way. In the days after the blaze, investigators and reporters would sift through the ashes of the building, but they also dug into the people who had called it home. Who were the ones lost? Who survived? And most importantly, what exactly happened inside Maple Court that night?
When the flames were finally contained, the building stood like a blackened skeleton against the early morning sky. Fire crews worked through the smoldering wreckage, their boots crunching over glass, wood, and ash. The acrid smell of smoke hung in the air, clinging to everything it touched. By sunrise, the street outside Maple Court was lined with police cars, fire engines, and news vans. Families who had escaped stood shivering in borrowed blankets, watching as their homes and memories were reduced to ruin. Some clutched each other in silence. Others broke down when rescue crews carried out the lifeless bodies of those who hadn't made it. The official report in those first hours was simple: an accident. A tragic electrical fault, perhaps, or a kitchen fire gone out of control. Fires in older buildings weren't uncommon. And yet, something about this one felt different. Detective Angela Lopez, assigned to oversee the case, arrived just after dawn. She was seasoned, methodical, not easily swayed by emotion. But even she felt the weight in the air. Too many unanswered questions lingered. One survivor, Marcus Reynolds, told investigators he had smelled smoke long before the alarms blared, as if the blaze had been burning quietly for a while, unnoticed. Others insisted they never heard the alarms at all, raising concerns about whether the system had even worked that night. Then came the issue of the stairwell. Several survivors swore that when they tried to escape, the main exit was blocked, not by fire, but by heavy objects, as though someone had deliberately placed them there. Investigators also noted the fire's unusual speed. Entire hallways were engulfed in minutes, faster than a typical accidental blaze should spread. A seasoned fire marshal at the scene quietly admitted to a colleague that accelerants, flammable liquids, could not yet be ruled out. Still, no one wanted to voice those suspicions publicly. Not yet. It was too soon, and the grief outside was too raw. Families were still identifying bodies, and survivors were just beginning to process what had happened. But as the smoke cleared, one thing became certain: this was no ordinary fire. Detective Angela Lopez knew that the investigation had to look deeper, beyond the charred walls, beyond the ashes, into the lives of those who lived inside.
Because if someone had set this fire intentionally, then the answers would lie not in the building itself, but in the stories of the people who once called it home. As the fire crews packed their hoses and left, the apartment complex transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance, holding back onlookers. Behind it, investigators combed through blackened rubble, bagging fragments of debris, wires, and melted plastic. Forensic teams worked methodically, sifting through layers of ash. They tested burned flooring for chemical traces, hoping to determine whether an accelerant had fueled the flames. A faint but unmistakable scent of gasoline seemed to linger in parts of the corridor, a detail quietly noted but not yet made public. Meanwhile, Detective Angela Lopez began to map out the lives of the residents. She knew that behind every locked apartment door lay stories, some ordinary, some secret. And sometimes it was those secrets that turned deadly. Apartment 2B, David and Linda Parker. David was a construction worker, Linda a stay-at-home mother. Neighbors described them as a loving couple, but others whispered about arguments late at night, voices raised behind thin walls. Apartment 3C, Marcus Reynolds. A college student who escaped through a window. He claimed he smelled smoke earlier than anyone else. Why hadn't he reported it? Apartment 4A, the Johnson family. Parents with 2 children. Both children perished in the fire. Neighbors remembered tension over overdue rent, eviction threats, and quiet bitterness toward management. Apartment 5D, Evelyn Moore, a retired nurse who lived alone. Known for keeping meticulous journals, she was also the first to insist that the alarms never rang. Each tenant carried a history. Each could hold a piece of the truth. Then came another puzzle, the fire alarm system. Technicians brought in by the city reported that the wiring had been tampered with. It hadn't simply failed, it had been deliberately disabled. Lopez felt the pit in her stomach. If the fire was arson, the act had been coldly calculated, and whoever set it had ensured that residents would have little chance of escape. But the question remained, who would want an entire building of people dead? Was it personal revenge? Insurance fraud? A cover-up for something larger? As investigators dug deeper, the first hints of motive began to surface. One resident had recently taken out a suspiciously large renter's insurance policy. Another was entangled in debts that had grown impossible to pay. And building management had its own skeletons. Citations for safety violations, lawsuits over neglect, and whispers of corruption in city contracts. The ashes of Maple Court concealed more than burnt wood and metal. They concealed human motives, greed, desperation, anger, the kind of motives that could turn a spark into a deadly inferno. Detective Lopez began to focus on one name that kept surfacing. Marcus Reynolds, the 23-year-old college student from apartment 3C. Reynolds had escaped the fire in a way that raised questions. While most residents fled in chaos, Reynolds claimed he had smelled smoke earlier than anyone else, but thought little of it. By the time he jumped from his window, flames had already engulfed the stairwell. To Lopez, that detail nagged. Why hadn't Marcus called 911 sooner? Why had he waited until the fire was nearly out of control? When detectives pulled his background, more red flags appeared. Marcus was months behind on rent. His scholarship had recently been revoked after allegations of academic dishonesty. On top of that, records show he owed thousands of dollars in credit card debt. Neighbors painted a divided picture. Some described Marcus as polite, quiet, always with his head in a guest book. Others mentioned loud arguments with his landlord about money and late-night visitors that looked more like loan collectors than friends. The more Lopez looked, the more complicated Marcus appeared. Then came the evidence that tied him closer to the fire. In the rubble near his apartment door, investigators found remnants of a melted container, the type often used to store gasoline. Lab results confirmed accelerant traces on it. When questioned, Marcus denied everything. He said he had no reason to hurt anyone and claimed the container wasn't his. But his alibi was shaky. On the night of the fire, he said he had been in his room studying. Yet no textbooks or notes were found in the ashes of his apartment, only empty beer cans and burnt-out candles. And then there was his laptop. Though damaged by heat, forensic experts managed to recover fragments of his search history. Among them, how fast does gasoline burn indoors? Building fire insurance investigation. Do fire alarms work during a power outage? It wasn't enough to arrest him outright, but it shifted Marcus from survivor to prime suspect. Still, Lopez hesitated. Something about his demeanor felt off. Not like a guilty man, but someone hiding another secret. Was Marcus truly the one who set the blaze? Or was he simply the easiest person to blame in the tragedy full of unanswered questions? The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear the midnight apartment fire wasn't just about flames. It was about lives unraveling, one by one.
As investigators pressed Marcus, another name started surfacing in whispers around the burned-out complex. Gerald Whitman, the landlord. Whitman was a man in his mid-50s, stocky build, sharp suits that seemed out of place in the crumbling building he owned. To the tenants, he was known less for kindness and more for his relentless pursuit of rent. Many residents had stories of Gerald banging on doors late at night, demanding payment, or threatening eviction notices taped to apartment doors. The fire, as tragic as it was, happened at a convenient moment for him. Investigators discovered that Gerald had recently filed an insurance policy worth nearly $2.5 million on the property, an unusually high amount given the state of the aging apartments. Even stranger, the policy had been updated only 2 weeks before the blaze. When detectives asked him about it, Gerald claimed it was just standard business practice, but the timing raised eyebrows. Tenants recall heated arguments between Gerald and residents who had fallen behind on rent. One even reported hearing him say, "If this place went up in flames, it would be worth more than it is now." That statement, paired with the new insurance policy, gave Gerald motive. But motive wasn't enough. Investigators needed a link. During the cleanup, fire inspectors discovered that several fire alarms in the building had been intentionally disabled. They weren't just broken from age, wires had been deliberately cut. Maintenance logs showed Gerald was the last person to check those systems only days before the fire. Lopez took note. If the alarms had been working, many lives might have been saved. Instead, silence allowed the fire to spread unnoticed until it was too late. When confronted, Gerald grew defensive. He claimed faulty wiring was common in old buildings and denied tampering with anything. But Lopez couldn't ignore the anger in his voice, the way his hands trembled when pressed about the insurance payout. And then came another twist. An anonymous caller contacted the police, claiming they had overheard Gerald arguing with someone over the phone the night of the fire. According to the caller, Gerald shouted, "If it takes fire to get rid of him, so be it." The call couldn't be verified, but it deepened the suspicion that Gerald's role wasn't just negligence. For Detective Lopez, the picture was becoming more complicated. Marcus had motive through desperation. Gerald had motive through profit. Both men stood in the shadows of the fire, but only one had set the flames. The investigation was no longer just about reconstructing a timeline. It was about untangling two very different lives and finding which one held the truth.
While the spotlight was on Marcus and Gerald, Detective Lopez wasn't convinced the circle of suspects was complete. Fires, she knew, often brought out hidden grudges, and sometimes the most overlooked people carried the deepest motives. Her attention soon shifted to Angela Reed, a neighbor in her late 30s, who had lived 2 doors down from the Morgans for nearly a decade. On the surface, Angela seemed like a quiet woman who mostly kept to herself. But neighbors remembered long-standing tension between her and the Morgans. Angela often complained about the children playing in the hallways, the late-night arguments she claimed echoed through the thin walls, and even the smell of food drifting from the Morgans' kitchen. What seemed like petty disputes slowly escalated over the years. Detectives learned of multiple noise complaints Angela had filed with the landlord, merely a dozen in the past year alone. Police records even showed 2 heated confrontations between Angela and Marissa, one of which ended with Angela threatening, "One day you'll regret the way you treat people in this building." It could have been an idle outburst, but when Lopez reviewed security footage from a nearby street camera, her team noticed something unusual. Angela was seen leaving the building just minutes before the first flames appeared in the Morgans' apartment. She was carrying a small duffel bag. When asked about it, Angela claimed she had been going to a friend's house across town, but her story didn't add up. The friend she mentioned later denied ever seeing her that night. The inconsistencies were troubling enough, but then came the discovery that shifted suspicion further. Fire investigators identified an accelerant used to speed up the blaze, a common household chemical. Receipts found in Angela's apartment showed that she had purchased large quantities of the same product only 3 days before the fire. Angela grew defensive when confronted. She said she bought it for cleaning purposes, but Lopez couldn't shake the timing. Combined with her volatile history with the Morgans, the evidence painted her as someone who may have snapped after years of resentment. For the first time, Lopez considered that the fire may not have been about profit or desperation, but about revenge. Still, the case remained tangled. 3 suspects now stood in the shadows. Marcus, broken by hardship. Gerald, driven by money. Angela, consumed by anger. Each had motive. Each had opportunity. And each carried secrets that could turn suspicion into guilt. But the truth was that only one set of hands had set the match that night. As the weeks went on, investigators collected evidence, ran tests, and cross-examined suspects. But the story of the fire wasn't just about theories and fingerprints. It was about people, those who lived through it, and those who barely made it out. For the survivors, the memories of that night were more than just details in a police report. They were scars etched into their hearts. One survivor, Denise Carter, a young mother of 2, described waking up to her daughter's screams. She recalled the searing heat when she opened her bedroom door, the thick smoke that clawed into her lungs. She recalled thinking, "If I go back for my son, neither of us will make it out." Somehow she did, both children clutched in her arms, collapsing onto the pavement outside, coughing and trembling. Another resident, Mr. Henry Wallace, an elderly man in his 70s, had lived in the apartment complex for over 20 years. He described how the flames seemed to swallow the hallways before his eyes. It was a neighbor, a teenager named Eric Daniels, who kicked down his door and carried him out onto the street. Henry's voice cracked as he said, "If that boy hadn't been there, I wouldn't be talking to you right now." These testimonies painted a picture of chaos, fear, and impossible choices. Some neighbors spoke of hearing banging on walls as families tried to warn each other. Others remembered the sound of breaking glasses as desperate residents jumped from second-story windows to escape. For the families who lost loved ones, the grief was unbearable. Candlelight vigils were held outside the burned-out building. Teddy bears, flowers, and handwritten notes piled up at the gate, silent reminders of the lives taken in minutes. Detective Lopez often attended these vigils, standing quietly at the back. She didn't show it in front of her team, but each name read aloud that night only sharpened her determination. The fire wasn't just a case file. It was stolen futures, broken families, and a community ripped apart. And somewhere among the suspects they were investigating was the person responsible for all of it. The survivors wanted answers. The families wanted justice. And Lopez knew the investigation had to cut deeper because the longer it dragged on, the more it felt like the flames had never really gone out.
Detective Lopez knew the fire wasn't just an accident. It was deliberate, and it was personal. But to prove it, she had to dig into the people closest to that building. One by one, the names surfaced, and one by one, they were called in. Marcus Hill, the ex-boyfriend of a tenant who died in the blaze, was the first. In the small gray interview room, the ticking clock seemed louder than his own voice. He insisted he had nothing to do with the fire, that he was miles away at a friend's house. But when pressed about his whereabouts earlier in the evening, his story stumbled. He avoided eye contact, his hands restless on the table. Lopez leaned in, calm but unrelenting. Marcus, this isn't just about a fire. Children died. Families are destroyed. Where were you, really? Then came Gerald Thomas, a man with a history of complaints against the building's landlord. He was known for his short temper and loud threats at tenant meetings. Gerald arrived at the precinct defensive, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. When detectives asked where he'd been on the night of the fire, he exploded. "Why are you even looking at me? I lived there too. You think I'd burn down my own home?"